Hello, everyone. This is Feliz. I'm the executive director of OneV. We're a nonpartisan organization that shares the experiences and stories of American voters and communities that honor their roles as voting citizens. OneV also shares facts and information about past and upcoming elections with the hope that all Americans exercise their right to vote in local, state, and federal elections. As many of you know, this year, OneV is committed to providing vital information on state-level races, which often don't get enough attention. As you know, most of the news stories are about federal races, the midterms, and the upcoming presidential election. However, state-level public officials hold an enormous amount of power around specific issues that affect ordinary Americans. They also have power that has implications for the fairness of elections, including presidential elections. Today, I am super delighted to be joined by Lorena Austin, who is running for the House of Representatives in Arizona, District 9, along with Seth Blattman, who we'll have the pleasure of speaking with later in this series. Lorena is an advocate and community leader who has worked with local restaurants and volunteers to provide support for Indigenous communities during the pandemic. Lorena also champions quality, affordable healthcare, housing, and strong public education for every Arizonan. Without further ado, let's turn our attention now to our very special guest, Lorena. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great. So Lorena, let's start at the beginning. As you know, at OneV, we love to tell stories of folks who are running. So if you wouldn't mind just starting at the beginning, telling us about your personal story and really what led you from a personal standpoint to run for public office.
Yeah, it's a long story, but I'll keep it brief. I think what, initially started my love for just community and public service is my family. So I come from a long line of people who work hard and show up for their community. My grandparents were farm workers. My parents would go on to, both of them and individually would go on to be advocates for the Chicano movement and civil rights movements in the 60s and 70s. And so it might be no surprise that I'm here. My father is a civil rights attorney. My mom's a social worker and teacher. I'm a student government advisor at my local community college here in Mesa, the community college that I went to, graduated from, and then went on to Arizona State University and got my degree in immigration policy and economy. And long story short is my family has lived in this district for 100 years on my father's side. So super rooted in our community, have always been community advocates. My nana and tata owned a little tiendita in the segregated part of Mesa here, where they serviced everyone in our community and really championed the rights for minorities here. And that work was continued by my father, who helped establish some local organizations as well. And so when I learned about redistricting this year, I was actually on my way to law school when I realized that I felt no one who was actually from this community was going to advocate for this community. And given that my family has such a strong history, I pulled all my applications and I decided to run. And it's been the best thing I could have ever done, because I think this election has been the most critical that I can remember in my lifetime. And so I don't regret putting, my name in and making sure that we have someone who actually works here, lives here, volunteers here, advocating for us at the state level. Because for so long, I don't believe we've had a voice in that bridge. And that's what I would like to bring, because I know my community so well. I do believe there are resources that aren't actually getting to my community, but that entails a lot of trust, right, and relationship building. And that's something that I've been doing for a long time, but something that I'm going to continue to do regardless of the outcome of the election. So I'm just really excited to be able to advocate, and I get to, knock doors and meet new people, and people tell me stories about my nana and tata that I've never heard before. I never got to meet my tata, for example, but people, remember them. And so it's been a really humbling experience to know that we can actually have our voice represented at the legislature when it's so critically needed.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lorena. That's probably one of the best answers I've heard yet in this series. It's admirable to see people who are deeply rooted in their communities and just to have these great traditions passed down through generations, leading to a life in public service. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
sharing
Thank
that. Um,
thank-
Lorena, focusing a little bit on some of your professional work,
Sure.
and why you feel like the next best step in your career is to run for office. Can you talk a little bit about that,
Yeah.
about some of the professional work you've done and why you feel like public service is really the next best step for you?
Yeah, I think, overall, I'd love to reframe what a politician looks like. I think it needs to be someone who understands what their community needs and understands, the diversity and vibrance, of our community and also how different it is and intersectional. But for me personally, it's kind of a long thing because I came back to college after 10 years. So I dropped out of college like 5 times after high school because I just didn't think I had that intellect, which I know is now a false, narrative that some students feel. And so when Ferguson happened in 2014, I was living in St. Louis at the time when Michael Brown was killed, and that was my, glass shattering moment of I didn't know how to constructively say what I felt. So I came back to school after 10 years and took my first sociology class. My major became sociology. I became student body president, and then I transferred to Arizona State University, where I was accepted into this incredible leadership program. But they required us that we worked in all different sectors. So we had to work in the public, the profit, and the private sector, nonprofit and private sectors. So I had incredible experiences. I've worked everywhere from a district level at a higher institution of education. I've worked for Verizon's innovative learning program to bring advanced technology to Title I schools across the country. I got to advise a leadership camp local here to Arizona that's focused on social justice issues and really creating the next generation of involved, active, and character-driven leaders that are focused around inclusivity. And then, so I've had a lot of experience. I've also worked part-time with my father at his law office. So kind of this whole, all these experiences that I've had, especially in the past 10 years, I think have really helped me prepare for, running for office. Because again, if you're centered around community and understanding the needs of it, will only prepare you. Because if there is one thing I've learned this whole time I've been campaigning, is that you don't need to know policy, you need to know your community. You can learn policy, anyone can learn that. I mean, they teach it to you when you get there. So I really have become this advocate of trying to tell others that you don't, need to again look like this cookie cutter idea of what we think a politician is. You don't have to go to an Ivy League. You don't have to have a law degree. You really need to know who and what your community looks like. So I think that's what has really helped me come to this point in my life right now. I didn't think I would run. Now I thought maybe in the future that would be something I would do. So this was unexpected, but totally necessary.
Right. Well, it's a long and very impressive resume, a wealth of experience, Lorena,
Thanks.
and also quite inspirational for you to come back to certain things like your studies
Uh,
and recommit yourself to those things that you feel like are going to serve you well in public
yeah.
office. So that's wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. It wasn't easy, but
Yeah.
definitely necessary. But you can do it. I mean, I
Yeah.
think too, when you have some life
Mhm.
experience, it helps
Mhm.
coming back after all those years. So I know my journey is not linear, but none of
Yeah.
ours really are. And I'm super grateful that I had that experience before I came back to school.
Great lessons for many of us. Very good lessons. So, Lorena, you're running for the State House of Representatives in Arizona, District 9. For those of our followers that are not familiar with this particular district, can you talk a little bit about it and what are the main issues impacting folks in this district that you're hoping to work on?
Sure. So District 9 encompasses West Mesa. So Mesa is actually a pretty large city. So the way it's drawn up is kind of like almost a rectangle of West Mesa and two precincts of Tempe. So we're a suburb of Phoenix. We're probably like 20 minutes, east of Phoenix. But it's a very large community. So there's over 200, thousand people in this district. And it's incredible because you could not have cut it up any better than like my neighborhood and like where I grew up. But it is a working class, community and neighborhood. And there's a lot of challenges that we're facing. Housing is probably one of the biggest ones that I've seen. And when I talk to people telling me their rents have raised, in increments of $500, $600. We're seeing what I think is, the displacement of a really diverse, vibrant community. Even in spaces that were once segregated or redlined, in my head is like, you put these communities there, and now they're being essentially forced out and having to leave. So I've talked to so many people that simply just can't afford, to live here anymore. Their wages haven't necessarily risen with, the rising costs in housing. And there are, I think, ways we could, help curb this. We could enact anti-price gouging laws. We can, in some way stop private investors from just scooping up family housing and turning into short-term rentals. There aren't really any regulations around short-term rentals right now, but we simply also just don't have enough housing in general. Since the 2008 recession, nothing ever came to, as fast moving, in terms of creating and building more affordable housing. There's also just a stigma, I think, around affordable housing as well. So, and when you think about it, like, that's me right now. So I rent and I don't make $0. I work multiple jobs, but I don't make enough now to buy a $500,000, 1,200 square foot home in my own community that my family's lived in for generations. So we're disenfranchising a whole, generation of first time home buyers. And in America, that's how, like, you have obtained wealth, and that's, how you create that generational wealth. So it's really disheartening because I can't compete with other people that have, gained more capital than I have just by mere sense of time. We're also seeing, people that are rent burdened, and 30% of their income goes to rent. And even people who have affordable housing and vouchers, almost 90% of them can't even utilize it because it's just the rent's too high and they can't find anyone to take it. So housing's a big one. Sorry, I kind of went off on that one, but education's another huge one. Arizona ranks in the bottom of education funding and salaries for our teachers. So education's a big issue here at the doors. And then obviously abortion's a massive issue. When we come every door, people, are bringing it up. And I think for so long, that's kind of been a taboo issue, but we've really seen people galvanize around this issue. And that's important to them. Obviously, water in Arizona is a big deal as we're facing a huge water crisis. That's just to name a few. Voter suppression, I think, and obviously why we're here, I think Arizona introduced about 10% of the voter suppression bills this past session. And that's a lot when you consider, 10% nationally. So there's definitely a lot of things we need to address here in the state.
Definitely. Well, it sounds like you have a good handle over the most critical issues. And the first one you mentioned, affordable housing. We're hearing more and more about this issue from candidates across all levels. And as someone who actually works in the affordable housing space, I worked there my entire career. I get really excited to hear candidates talk about it. Would love to talk separately about that with you some other time. But thank you for mentioning that one first. You also mentioned voting rights, which as you know is a big focus for OneV. My question for you regarding voting rights is, how do you feel like you can make a difference as a state legislator? Being in the Arizona House, how do you feel like you can provide greater access to the ballot for citizens?
Yeah, I think what's really important, especially for Arizona, is understanding what's at stake. And honestly, I feel like it's just holding the line. I mean, we have to be able to tie in the legislature, which you mentioned earlier, is so important, these state legislative races, because last session, the GOP really came after voting rights. So we used to have Pebble, which was a permanent early voting list, and they passed a bill to make it an active early voting list. So what that does is essentially, if you haven't voted in recent years, you automatically get taken off of the early voting list. And it's just a way to, purge lists and ensure that people don't have, the access that they require to the ballots, whether that's in person or in mail. They want to eliminate drop boxes, prohibit voting centers, which has been incredible to create all inclusive voting centers, where if you're not in your county at that specific moment, you can go to one of these all-in-one voting centers and they'll print your ballot out and you're able to vote. They want to require that voting only occurs on election day. So that would obviously eliminate early voting entirely. So it's honestly holding the line. And so a lot of these bills didn't pass, but if we elect the current Republican, candidate slate into the legislature, we are going to have a major constitutional, I think, right infringed upon because they're already trying to make that happen. So holding this line is so important because we've also lost I think more moderate Republicans, in the primary. So we have a super extreme slate here in Arizona. So nothing is more critical, I think, than preserving the democracy. And honestly, I truly believe that um, our safety of democracy runs through Arizona this year. It'll have grave implications if we don't, elect good people to the legislature that will ensure that voting rights are accessible to every single citizen who's eligible to vote.
And Lorena, Arizona reminds us that it really rests with the state in terms of protecting voter rights. I know those of us that care about this issue have been waiting for a major bill to pass the U.S. Congress, but in the absence of that, it's the states really that are going to determine the fairness of upcoming elections. So thank you for pointing that out. Speaking of the importance of state legislatures, as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, they still don't seem to get as much attention as the federal races, right? Everybody just wants to talk about presidential polls and U.S. House and U.S. Senate races. As you talk to your constituents and as you go through your campaigning, how do you convince people to take greater interest in state legislative races? What's your sort of message to just any ordinary folks in your district to let them know, hey, you really have to care about state legislative races?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really is about education. I think, we don't necessarily, I mean, I think this is a national thing. We don't necessarily talk about voting, especially in midterms, and the way we talk about other subjects. And I think that's maybe intentional sometimes to kind of suppress voting. But also, I will say, I think what happened at the Supreme Court in banning abortion has really galvanized people to pay attention because now that I think people are realizing how much power rests within the state legislature. So it's been really good at the doors that people I think are actually more willing to listen about what a legislative district is, what a congressional district is. A lot of people just don't know. So I know that sometimes, especially people who are involved in politics or community leadership, we're so siloed. So we just assume that everyone knows the same information that we do, but they really don't because we have, residents and constituents who, are working those multiple jobs, who are trying to raise families, who are trying to get by. And so that might not be, on really the top of their mind that day, but it's just about education. And so it's been nice to have people be more interested in it. But I would love to, again, build that trust and create that bridge. And so I've been very intentional about going to communities that don't normally have someone come to their door and talk to them. And that's been so evident as we've been, specifically targeting Latinx communities of color. We almost have a 40% Latina population here in Mesa. So it's really important, I, understand Spanish, and just having someone who maybe looks like them and can understand them. It's just, very important that we're being inclusive. And so it's short-term and long-term, and it has to be. So I'm a both and type of person. Like, yes, I want to be here in the short term. I want to see you more than once. I don't want to be someone that just comes and visits you the week before election. I need to be continuous, and we have to build that relationship long-term if we want to see that impactful change.
Right. Amen. We are delighted to be on that journey with you, Lorena, to educate people about how important these races are. And as much as it pains me to cut a great conversation short, I think we're at time, and I know you're incredibly busy. Final question for you, Lorena. How can folks learn more about your story and your candidacy? Where do we go?
You can go to www.lorena4arizona.com. I'm also on Instagram, Facebook. Instagram is Lorena Austin AZ, and that's where I do a lot of reels and videos and stuff like that. But the website's probably the best way to reach me. And if you have any questions, shoot me an email, and I'll come back too if you want to talk more about some of these issues. I'd love to do that.
Good stuff. Lorena, thank you. We wish you the best of luck on behalf of OneV. Thank you so much for sharing your story, for sharing your passion for public service. And to our followers, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at our next interview in our 2022 State Legislative Series. Thank you so much.
Thanks.